Hello everybody, and welcome to Witte for today's symposium. Every contact leaves a trace, follow the... and so today's symposium, it departs from our current exhibition in the Belly of the Whale, which is on display on the second floor. So after the conference, if you have a chance to see it, do, because it provides some context to what we are doing today. But in brief, it's a group exhibition that departs from the story of Jonah and the whale, which we probably all know the story of. And we were interested, myself and Adam Kleinman, who's the other curator of the show, to examine how art objects or images can trace various social or political realities, various contexts through measuring reception or reading. But also that objects and images are not in themselves inert, but that they produce their own realities and affects as well, and supporting various discourses. So this sort of dialectical approach is borne out through the artworks and some scientific objects as well in the show upstairs. And I'll hand over to Adam to discuss a little more about today's proceedings and to introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Ooh, my voice. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Yeah, just wanted to do a little housekeeping. I'll be brief because we have a long day ahead of us. So everyone should have picked up one of these, I guess, on their seats. And it's just our little program guide. It has bios of everyone who we'll get to know more throughout the day, but I'll skip the biographical information in interest of time. But please do read it over. And then we'll have a little break in the middle. We'll do 3 presentations, including some screenings, then 3 more, well, 2 more, and then a plenary. So totally symmetrical. And please hold off any questions or whatever till that point, and we'll have a discussion, which I think is particularly pertinent. I just flew in from New York. I'm a New Yorker, and our friends over in England, where we got our language from, just in the OED made post-truth the word of the year. And for those of you who know what it means, I don't really know what it means, but basically supposedly coming out of this year, 2016, the year of fun, because of things such as our new president-elect, our United States, Donald Trump, and particularly his media campaign, which was, of course, similarly paralleling things such as Brexit and the Leave camp's rhetoric, which was filled with not only gross inaccuracies, but gross misrepresentations. And now that we all have to deal with this somehow, one of the big debates that's going on in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere, most probably in this country, and maybe that's something to talk about, is what is reception now, what is broadcast, what is discussion, when facts don't seem to really work anymore, when images have lives of their own that are radically manipulated, where the intention of the image might be totally different from its reception, and how those things move around in the world. And we were kind of feeling that fermenting a bit, so the exhibition, part of the reason why we took the Jonah idea was, of course, you know, the biblical story, and now I'm upset to have a Christian reference considering what's going on in the world, but of course, the prophet was inside the belly of the whale, and in there, cut off from context, he had to ruminate. And then ultimately, theoretically, he was shirking his responsibilities, and he goes out and does them. So in that kind of spirit, we were thinking that actually the exhibition itself is a bit investigative. It's not any sort of thesis kind of thing, because as the world has been telling us, certain forms of intentionality and interests don't often go how you expect. So similarly, today is in that spirit. It's kind of a series of a mix of keynotes and films by various artists and so on and so forth that we can consider not exactly like case studies, but little sort of road posts in which we can sort of rethink, you know, what it means to have something out in the world and what its use is. And particularly one of the things that we're kind of concerned with in the exhibition above was the classic idea of autonomy, right? The classic Enlightenment idea that something is cut off from itself and manifests as it's supposed to everywhere, independently, universally, so on and so forth. And Natasha and I thought that's not really true. There's many works upstairs, which I do invite you to go look at, that actually question that. The most illustrative one is a work by Katie Kollwitz, who is a German artist, I believe the first woman professor in German history, who made a protest image of starving children to critique food scarcity shortages after World War I. What happened, I can't remember the exact year of the work, it's the Weimar, it's the 20s, right? 20s. Of course, things changed in Germany in the 30s, which some people are looking at today. And in the lead up to the Nazi regime, of course, they created one of the most complex and contemporary propaganda, filmic, some would say. And what they did is they actually appropriated Katie Kollwitz's image and took the exact same image, which was a protest against hunger shortages. And interestingly, I mean, this is a much bigger debate because I'm not even going to get into that. But they appropriated the image and re-tagged it and used it for their own Nazi propaganda, saying, actually, if you let the communists into the chancellery, and if the communists take over as opposed to the National Socialists, this is what will happen. You'll have starving children and so on and so forth. So you have the exact same image, nothing changed about it, right? And two very different uses, and this is something to think about now. I don't know if people are in the mood for protesting and things like that, but it's a weird signpost to look at in relationship to this. Also, once the Nazis did come to power, Katie Kollwitz, of course, gets sacked from her job and goes into hiding, and that's a whole other story. So also, not only do things have histories and uses and affects and so on and so forth, and not only affects, actually instrumental uses in the world that are maybe very different from the original intention. There's also emanations of other histories that come out of it, and all of these things can be read. And that's kind of why the title is called Every Contract Leaves a Trace, Every Contact Leaves a Trace, and every contract does leave a trace. Hopefully, that's the point of them, right? It comes from Locard, who was the first forensic scientist in France, who created the modern idea of forensic science. So that's kind of floating around in there. But like I said, today this is just meant to be speculative and investigatory, and hopefully in the end we can bring it all together through the plenary and through some discussions. I've actually been going really long, so I'm just going to hand it over to Teixeira Pinto, who will kick us off really well, I think. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is this working? Yeah? Thank you. I was planning when Adam first invited me here to talk about conspiracy theory and cognitive mapping, which is this dialectical pair that Frederick Jameson formulated, or that Frederick Jameson conceptualized in '88, more or less, I would say. But I think that now, with the unfolding events of last week, maybe, or at least like I thought that maybe I do an intro that diverges a little bit from this lineage and goes more into this triangulation of ideology, economy, and conspiracy that I think is just like such a pressing or urgent question nowadays. And just to refer back to the topic of the exhibition, I was always wondering, like, how much we believe in objects as like a locus of resistance, and I think that's quite like a belief that we cling to in the art world. And I think that what we see now, and what we see also in the examples that Adam put forth, like this images that can be used in a like completely with a complete inversion of their meaning, is that actually maybe what we believe is the resistance or the object's resistance is actually, like as Tony Bennett put it, like the resistance of a narrative against another. So basically it's like narratives that are actually struggling with each other. And I think that we are really like at a crucial moment when, there is definitely one narrative that is taking root or taking hold of all the political spectrum. And yeah, it's probably time to fight back, but we don't actually know how or whom or with what. And so basically, to start structuring this a bit so that I don't get too all over the place. Ideology is like a modern concept, but of course, like, yeah, even though, of course, with time, the question of ideology, especially with mass communication media, is something that it's also like goes way back in history. So you can also like trace it to this classical moment. And the classical forms of ideology, one could say, are also like coming together with classical challenges, no? Like, so maybe the first formulation of ideology is this belief that might is right. So basically, whatever is that can impose its power is what has the right to be. And the first challenge to this formulation, or to this original formulation of ideology, would be the challenge of Antigona, no? When she challenges King Creon and buries her brother against the law, so basically disobeying the law. And she points there to this like dissociation of the law, like, no, there's the law of God and the law of man, and I would rather obey the law of God because I think that there is like some sort of like higher value or higher moral value in this law of God. And so this would be like the first moment when we have a challenge that is addressing ideology, that is saying, no, actually, I challenge your belief that might is right. Then, of course, we have the other classical challenge in Plato and Socrates, no, like, and there, like, the question of ideology could be perhaps formulated as what is must be. So basically, the way things are is the way things must be. And then the challenge is to say that no, like actually things are not what they appear, and you know, like we can actually create a hierarchy in between appearance and structure. Okay, structure is maybe like a very contemporary word, but I'm a little bit abusing classical philosophy here. In contemporaneity, or in the contemporary moment, ideology are the two basic, or the most whose scope is how to say, the widest in scope formulations of ideology are the one that is the most used in cultural studies. So basically, the idea that ideology is the confusion between what nature is and what culture does. So that you assume that something is natural when actually this something is cultural. For instance, the notion of gender is like a very common example for this discussion. And of course, the classical definition that Althusser put forth, that ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. This is a quote. And I think that is important to recuperate this term and its meaning, because, of course, like the question of ideology, though it had been completely dismissed in the last 30 years or so, now, you know, like came back with immense force. And everybody's arguing whether fake news on Facebook or the spread of false information or misinformation, it had an impact in the election. Everybody's arguing whether racism was the reason, or whether economical grievances were the reason for electing Trump. And I think that what interests me about it is that, of course, this question is very tied to the mise of Marxism and Marxist hermeneutics, because, of course, like the moment the USSR collapsed was also the moment when Marxism was dismissed as a discourse. And, of course, like the notion of ideology is central in Marxism, not because of ideology per se, but because of this, like, because the whole theory hinges on this idea that, of course, there is like reality, you know, like that the way you perceive your existence is not, it's distorted by this kind of like, it has a, it's, sorry, I'm a bit sick and I'm the way you perceive your existence is filtered by this imaginary distortions, no, like, so that it's never, you never have like an objective or accurate or factual perception of what are the structures that are actually in charge or that are actually imposing themselves. And I think that now we are really, and it's also like something that we've been discussing widely, is the return of this moment when, like prior to World War II or in between World War II and World War T, or World War, that's actually, indeed. It's a slip of the tongue, but actually I think we are somewhere between World War II and World War III. And that question was a question that was posed most famously by Wilhelm Reich, basically in the wake of the Reichstagsbrandverordnung, so the Reichstag fire decree, that was edited in February 28th of 1933. And the Reichstag fire decree suspended all the civil rights protections that were afforded by the Weimar Republic. And the question Wilhelm Reich asked was, how could the masses vote for their own oppression? So basically, how could the people of Germany vote to be repressed? And this, of course, occurred in the wake of Hitler being appointed chancellor. He was appointed chancellor in January 30 of 33. And Reich was trying to grapple with the fact that the German people had apparently chosen the authoritarian politics promoted by National Socialism against their own political interests. And ever since this question, like the question of like how could you vote against your own interests, or how could you vote for your own oppression, has been a central question in political philosophy. Of course, with Trump winning in the election after openly campaigning for less democracy, and with the continued electoral success of the far right across Europe, this question is again an urgent question. Now, writing in 1936, Walter Benjamin also saw fascism as a mock revolution. He defined it as a mobilization of revolutionary demands towards an epic feat of showmanship, which stages the power of the masses without granting the masses rights. Fascism, he noted, gives expression to the people or to the people's will to power while preserving capitalist class structures and keeping property relations intact. The outcome of this revolutionary carnival is the spectacularization of politics, mass rallies, histrionics, paranoid discourse, and the need to turn the lack of material resources into a drama of presence and absence charged with sexual intensity. Now, as I said before, ever since Trump won, we have been debating and fighting over whether those who voted for him were economically disenfranchised or motivated by racist or xenophobic sentiments. And Marxist theory traditionally tends to depict fascism as a form of mistaken choice, which results from false consciousness. So basically you would say that the people are gullible and thus easily led into contradictions. But Reich, for instance, refused to absolve the people who cheered for Hitler, and he argued instead that Marxism was unable to understand the power of an ideological movement like Nazism because it lacked an adequate conception of ideology's material force as an emotional or affective structure. So basically what he's saying is that the masses did not mistakenly choose fascism, rather there is a more fundamental non-identity between class consciousness and mass movements. So, in other words, mass movements do not arise from class consciousness because the basic features over which people identify are not necessarily like class. Now, the idea of the forgotten working men and women, which we have been all, again, debating and fighting over, could we... I wanted to show you, this is painted by John McNaughton that was bought by Sean Hannity and gifted to President-elect Trump. The painting is going to be brought to the White House. And I don't know how to interpret it completely because I must admit some of the figures are hard to recognize, but you can see that, of course, President Obama is trampling on the Constitution. Behind him is Madison that looks shocked, like completely bereft of the fact that he's like stepping on the Constitution. The despondent man sitting on the bench is the forgotten man, so basically the forgotten worker or forgotten working class white male citizen, obviously. And is surrounded by Lincoln, Reagan, George Washington, and maybe Adam knows who the other one is because I actually don't recognize. So Lincoln, Reagan, George Washington, and there's another one that's probably Franklin?
No.
No?
No, they're all presidents. It's, I think it's Adams and Madison. No, Madison.
No, Madison is the one that is...
That's Jackson.
Anyway, on the side of the evil ones that are clapping President Obama, who's completely oblivious to the sufferance of the forgotten man, you see Clinton, but you also see the two Roosevelts, so Teddy and FDR, and George Bush was also placed on the side of the evil ones. And strangely enough, you see in the middle, and it's a bit like, I think it's on the side of this position, you see Kennedy, and it's not clear whether he's with Obama or with Reagan. He's definitely staring at, he looks towards Obama, so maybe he's in the side of evil. But again, he was murdered himself, and he's an American martyr, so maybe the painter didn't want it to be too blunt about it. As I was saying, this idea of the forgotten working man and woman has this twofold origin because it was a figure of a trope that was for the first time popularized in 1932 in the aftermath of the Great Depression. And it was precisely Roosevelt, FDR, that called upon the country to tend to the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. These were his words. At the same time, FDR was pushing for an economic stimulus in order to halt both the fascist tide and the pull towards communism. But this expression resurfaced again, so it had a second birth. And this second birth is tied to President Nixon. President Nixon is, interestingly enough, absent. No, he's not absent. He's there. He's on the side of the evil ones. The second birth of the expression is tied to President Nixon, who spoke of the silent majority in the aftermath of the race riots of '68. But he did not refer to the forgotten working classes. He referred to the white percentage of the population who resented the end of formal racism, so the end of the Jim Crow, and who equated the anti-war movement with treason. Now, obviously, Trump retained both of these origins of the expression of the forgotten man, and what you hear when he mentions it or when he speaks about it is, of course, like a function of where you stand. So it's not so much something that has to do with the expression, it has to do with the audience. as we said before, capitalism is of course a multidimensional force whose properties can only be experienced partially. So we tend to see, or all we tend to see are its epiphenomena. We tend to see rising house prices, racism, inequality, cheap appliances, sushi in every street corner, but its full scope remains hard to grasp. And as Susan Buck-Morse points out, the imaginary of the nation state is a purely political imaginary, so the economy plays no role in it. But precisely because economic actors are not recognized as political agents, capitalism is incapable of providing a code that will apply to the whole of the social field, as Deleuze and Guattari already had mentioned in Mille Plateaux. Instead, what it does is to set in motion a deterritorializing machine which is plagued by contradictions. Theoretically, at least, the free movement of capital should lead to a corresponding free movement of workers, in which case capitalism, which would be then unable to sustain its mode of production, would dissolve into a different socio-historical figure. And it is because of this, or it is from this perspective, that capitalism requires or necessitates fascism to violently and artificially reterritorialize social and sexual mores. You see, immigrants, for instance, they would be the ideal capitalist subjects because most migrants on temporary work arrangements are not entitled to vote, they are not entitled to any forms of benefits. But even when working illegally, they are still taxable because everything they consume pays VAT. And on the other hand, the abolition of immigration restrictions would eventually even out wages across the globe, and the labor supply would dry up in the places that exploit it the most. So this question, or like this, let's say this conundrum, is what explains the surge in nationalist rhetoric and the need to fix unmoored labor by reinstituting national boundaries. As long as capitalism remains able to recruit fascist rhetoric to wage war on the underclasses, the two figures can happily coexist. But the balance is precarious, which is why liberal democracies tend to cultivate fascist fantasies whilst marginalizing fascist parties. To put it in very blunt terms, the current consensus believes that the masses must be heard when the masses voice racist sentiments, that is, when the masses reject cultural globalization, but it believes that same masses must be crushed or ignored when they voice anti-austerity sentiments or when they reject market dogma. This is why, for instance, the Syriza, the Arab Spring, Podemos, Occupy were all marginalized or crushed as movements, whilst nativism, nationalism, and xenophobia are normalized. And Adam was mentioning this just now while we were having a coffee, that the speed at which this normalization is occurring now is frightening. Like the speed at which the normalization of Trump is occurring in the media is actually staggering. An article in The Guardian I recently read even equated anti-gentrification protests with xenophobia because the demonstrators were rallying against foreign oligarchs buying scores of properties in London. So basically, like, the confusion goes up to the point where we are completely like entangling this sentiments of like hostility towards foreigners with hostility towards foreign money or foreign capital. And the rejection of globalist neoliberalism is possible culturally, but not or never economically. If one wants to see what the future will bring, one just has to look at UK, whose foreign secretary is articulating the demands of the new global order. We want free markets without freedom of movement. At least this is precisely the deal that Boris Johnson was now proposing the EU. And it's more or less the same platform Trump was campaigning on, this idea that, you know, like we will keep, or basically we will keep globalization in its economic form, but we will not keep globalization in its cultural form. And of course, like the coming international agreements like the TTPE will reduce custom duties and other commercial barriers, but they will not introduce any measures to combat fiscal or climate dumping in those same treaties. And all of this, like CETA or the new trade deal that is now being renegotiated with the Pacific regions, remain strictly commercial treaties, meaning they are not in any case formulated in terms of political economy. So basically, again, they are tied to this imaginary of the nation state as a purely political territory. And of course, like economically speaking, this new order has been 30 years in the making. I don't know, how are we time-wise? 7 more minutes. So I'm just gonna jump over this. I'm gonna summarize it very briefly. I think more or less everybody is aware of this, that what happened in the last 30 years was that we replaced policies that were trying to have or trying to achieve full employment or universal employment with policies that are vying to keep a certain percentage of unemployment at all times. This is called the NAIRU. The NAIRU is an acronym, is a concept that was introduced by Milton Friedman, and it means exactly the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Because you need to have a certain level of unemployment in order to prevent inflation. So basically, if you want to avoid having an inflationary economy, you have to keep a certain percentage of the population unemployed. This happens because the moment the population is fully employed, there is no coercion that can be used to keep laborers in their jobs. So basically, laborers are free to roam around, you know, like to browse the job market to find better wages. So what the effect of this is that wages keep being pushed up. And of course, if wages are pushed up, the only means for capital owners to still harvest, you know, like to still retain a share of profits is to also push the prices up. So, you know, like what you have is this like effect where wages and prices basically push each other up. And in order to combat this, like the proposal of the Austrian School of Economics and the Chicago School of Economics was to invert this mechanism and to basically create an economy that benefits creditors instead of debtors. And after 30 years of these policies, also, and one should not forget, after the bargaining power of the working classes was completely crushed by globalization, or like by the outsourcing of production, wage earners are now obviously too much in debt in an environment where wages cannot rise. Actually, they are deflated, that they keep shrinking. And the value of the debt itself keeps rising. So basically, it's an impossible situation, and economically or even mathematically speaking, is unsustainable. Because the debtors cannot pay, be it individuals or nations, and therefore they will not pay. But because the financial sector demands repayment of these debts, the nation states have been reconverted into debt collection agencies. So basically, the nation states are now acting on behalf of the financial sector, and they are trying to extract rent or debt repayment from their population. Of course, all of the political spectrum from the center left to the center right, so basically all the parties that have been in and out of government in the last 30 years are completely implicated in this policy. And this is what makes the situation so volatile and so potentially ripe for this, like either far right or far left to take over. And actually I don't remember who was arguing that recently. I don't know if it was Alain Badiou or someone else that was saying that this is also the return of antagonism in politics. And basically it means that the idea of consensus that has been winning elections since the last 30 years can no longer win elections. Know that now elections are now going to be fought and won in antagonistic terms. And again, we come to the question of ideology and identification. It's like, are we gonna win and lose these elections by identifying via identity policies or via race or via nativism? Or are we gonna fight these elections and are we gonna fight these political struggles by identifying via economical class or economical structures? To resume briefly, and to, am I like already completely 2 minutes? Okay, so I just wanted to mention the question of conspiracy in relation to the question of ideology. Susan Buck-Morss, to return to Susan Buck-Morss, argued that the defining move for the 20th century global order was the geopolitization of communism. By forging an identity between communism and the Soviet Union, the Western Bloc could equate internal dissents with treason, casting unionized labor as unpatriotic, and viewing opposition to capital as aggression by a foreign nation. This, of course, normalized the enemy, which would otherwise represent an absolute threat, because it challenged both space as the determinant of sovereignty and the separation between political and economic discourses, upon which capitalism is predicated. So basically in the US, for most of the recent history, to be a leftist was to be an American, in the sense of both an alien presence and a moral threat. This is I'm quoting Susan Buck-Morss, sorry. And this also tied dissent to paranoia and conspiracy, producing a discourse about internal enemies. Most importantly, in order to displace the notion of class identification and solidarity, it tied collective identity to national homogeneity. And needless to say, racism is always the shadow cast by this, by the way national homogeneity is sort of. The geopolitization of the protests that became known as the Arab Spring are also mirroring this strategy. They are confining dissent to a specific geolocation and obscuring the continuity between these uprisings and other protest movements such as the Indignados or the Occupy. And once again, the social struggles are displaced onto the site of a phantasmic antagonism between the free world and Islamic fundamentalism, as it's usually narrated. To return to paranoia, Richard Hofstetter argued, and this is a piece that was first published in the Harper's Bazaar magazine, called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, that the idea of the paranoid style, and I quote him, as a force in politics would have little contemporary relevance or historical value if it were applied only to men with profoundly disturbed minds. It is the use of paranoid modes of expression by more or less normal people that makes the phenomenon significant. Now, Emily Apter, literary theorist, called this style one worldlessness, adding one, which stands for one world. So basically this idea of planetary integration that became so popular after exhibitions such as The Family of Man, but also like after the publication of, help me, Stuart Brand, the magazine? What? Exactly, thank you. Sometimes the most obvious things escape us. So she added this suffix one to Hannah Arendt's concept of worldlessness, which for Arendt means or defines the condition of those who do not matter as individuals. So it expresses their lack of a social and political world. Typically, this condition, at least in Arendt's discourse, afflicts people who are stateless or otherwise deprived of political rights. But it can also be extrapolated to all those who are deprived of a way to make their actions significant and their opinions effective. So basically, in short, anyone who has been alienated from the public realm. And as Hofstadter notes, to return to Hofstadter briefly, the situation becomes worse when the representatives of a particular social position are shut out of the political process. Having no access to political bargaining or the making of decisions, they find their original conception that the world of power is sinister and malicious fully confirmed. They only see the consequences of power, and this through distorting lenses, and have no chance to observe its actual machinery. Hence, this world becomes an extension of paranoid subjectivity, and conspiracy theory becomes its mode of representation. So I end here.
Thank you, Anna.
Also, we didn't. Can we show very briefly this small little clip?
Yeah.
The military had learned in Vietnam that Tet of 68, for example, was a tactical victory of enormous proportions for it. We won. We virtually exterminated the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. In fact, when I got to Vietnam, I was fighting khaki-clad, Red Star-wearing North Vietnamese regulars. I wasn't fighting Viet Cong, NLF guerrillas. But that was portrayed by the American press as a strategic defeat for the United States because we had been lying, we the military had been lying about the NLF, about the Viet Cong, about the guerrillas. We said we defeated them, there weren't very many left and so forth. And then all of a sudden they mount this massive offensive all across the peninsula. So even though we won, we lost. We lost strategically, and we lost because of the press. And so the military took that in as a huge lesson learned. And the military said, never again. So what Powell is saying is simply the power of the camera is extremely distorting. It can change a victory into a defeat or defeat into victory. So be very careful about how you handle that camera afterwards. Make sure that camera is seeing what you want it to see. Make sure that camera knows that you won. Make sure that camera knows that you won everything. You didn't lose anything at all. And stay on that camera the whole time you're there. Embed them with your troops, for example. I'll never forget an expression from a CNN reporter. I was watching it on television. I couldn't believe he said it. He said, you know, I've been with these troops here. I've been with these troops for months now, and I've eaten with them, and I've slept with them, and I've fought with them, and I've seen what they've gone through and everything, but I'm not prejudiced. It was incredible. I mean, you know, here he was with the troops. He was loving them and living with them and everything else, but he wasn't prejudiced. That's what we wanted to do, and that's what we did. Capture the camera.
sorry. This clip that I just showed is an expert of a film called Hegemon by artist and filmmaker Danny Gall, and it wasn't premiered yet, so we are showing it with this permission, but we can only show a short clip, and possibly you will be able to see it when it premieres in an exhibition in its full scope. I just wanted to note very briefly that later on, our protagonist is going to note that what actually had an adverse impact in their amazing, brilliant strategy of embedding journalists was the advent of Al Jazeera. So basically, Al Jazeera was what foiled their plans. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and we can pick up on more of your material maybe later in the plenary. So now I'd like to welcome up Patrick Goddard, artist, who is going to guide us to his camera also.
Hi, I'm going to show 2 shortish films. Yeah, microphone. Hello. I'm going to show 2 shortish films. I'll talk a little bit in between them around, but not directly about the films because I hate somehow explaining my own work. So we're just going to start off with quite a recent film called Calyx Rustic Lamp Large. It's just like 6 minutes long, so bear with me. So have you noticed that in the last few years, all of the light bulbs in all the pubs and cafes and stuff have been switched out for these big retro industrial things, like we're in the fucking 1950s or something.
Yeah, I guess.
And it's like some guilty interior design afterthought following East London's latest architectural reboot.
Sure.
And I was thinking about it, and I think these light bulbs are trying to simulate a sense of heritage and a historical continuity for the area, desperately trying to escape homogenized urban design. But the problem is everyone else had exactly the same idea at exactly the same time. So yeah, these sort of like outdated bits of technology are being used to align themselves stylistically to the past, or like at least what they have romanticized the past as being, because everyone knows that old-fashioned stuff makes you look more authentic of what, I don't know.
Right, okay. What's wrong with a bit of old-fashioned stuff? Not everybody wants a 40-inch flat-screen TV on the wall, or a 3D printer printing out bananas or whatever they print out.
Okay, look at the bartenders.
They're called baristas now, Patrick. They call them baristas.
Okay, look at the baristas. Yeah, I mean, it's hardly an old family-run cafe, is it?
They look like, don't you?
Okay, I'm not having a go at the actual, at the baristas. I'm just saying that last year this place was probably a community centre or something.
No, it used to be a laundrette.
A laundrette, exactly.
Yeah.
I bet. I'm surprised they didn't call it the Laundrette Cafe. Do you know Jaguar Shoes down in Shoreditch?
Yeah, sorry. Who's having the flat white?
Oh, yeah, that's me, thank you.
And the white Americano?
Thank you.
There you go.
That Jaguar Shoes trick of, ironically, not really ironically, calling your bar after the previous priced out tenants. I mean, there's another place I went to on Mare Street called the Advisory, because it used to be the Asian Women's Advisory Service, and now it's like a fucking bougie.
Well, they've got a bar down in Deptford now called the Job Centre.
Yeah, exactly. And and each one of them dangles these dejected bare bulbs. What I'm talking about is the slow erasure of an area's history, and a throwback aesthetic like this vintage light bulb is its guilty conscience.
You're like a Guardian think piece.
Well, I mean, they're trying to imitate the gritty simplicity of traditional East London / Brooklyn /
Well,
Berlin.com.
it's just a light bulb, you know. And light bulbs, as far as you go, are pretty innate. This one's quite good looking, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you know, what do you want them to have?
It's not about the light bulb. It's not about the light bulb, Kevin.
I'm sorry, but I thought you were talking about light bulbs, mate.
Well, whatever, these old-fashioned light bulbs will probably go out of fashion again in the next few years. So this observation, and with it this film that I'm talking to you about, and this recording will seem instantly out of date. So sorry to the people listening to this recording at home or in the gallery in the future or something. I mean, of course you're listening to it in the future, but I mean the more distant future. You know what I mean? Anyway, so there's this New York artist called Penny Arcade.
That's a cool name.
And and she said that nostalgia is the lie that protects us from the reality of who we actually grew up to be. I always quite like that line.
Well, Brixton's been changing a lot now. I mean, I'm sure you know around Brixton Market, things have been popping up all over the place.
Yeah, I was down there a few weeks ago for a friend's birthday thing.
Been in their hundreds. I mean, somewhere, you know, with light bulbs like this, you know, church pews for seating, scaffold planks for benches, and well, I saw a geezer with a cocktail in a jam jar.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Cocktails and jams. Artisanal cockles served on a building brick.
Exactly.
Multi-sensory experiences in multi-storey car parks.
Well, I'm talking more probably about pop-up restaurants and stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, a little while back, an actual posh restaurant that opened in the area, you know, one with the starch white napkins. Yeah, there was a big hoo-ha about that, proper uproar.
Yeah, big hoo-ha.
Yeah, but guess who it was most upset about it, and who was saying gentrification at Brixton Market? It was all these small cocktails and jam jar pop-up places.
Yeah.
And why? Because this new place was just like them, but without the pretense of rustic authenticity.
Yeah.
It forced them to confront their disowned selves. You know what I'm saying, Patrick?
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes criticism shows a guilty conscience.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, so that's really, I've never seen that projected so big before. It's supposed to be on a little kind of one of those box TVs that you get in all the galleries, which are hopelessly nostalgic themselves. It's a little sarcastic gesture. So there's a temptation within the arts, visual beings that we are, to prioritise aesthetics when thinking about the political. For example, what does gentrification look like? And whilst the aesthetic is, of course, political, critiquing it and in the case of art, reproducing it, can only offer a limited level of understanding. And by overemphasizing its importance, it can confuse symptom for cause, sign for signified, or be like confusing a light bulb for an electrical generator. So if artworks merely transfigure the appearance of the world by treating it stylistically, then as artists, we're doomed to merely renew the world according to current fashions, or simply reinforce the echo chambers of liberal elites whilst failing to produce active and productive criticism. So this can end up inadvertently fetishizing urban decay, for example, instead of genuinely investigating inner city poverty, or it could confuse capital accumulation for conspicuous consumption. Obviously they're linked, but so rather artworks that aim to move beyond this should use technical, formal, and even contextual innovations to reveal both how the artwork as object and the work's subject stand politically in relation to the world, in relation to class, and in relation to their own circulation in the cultural sphere. The alternative to this is just to reproduce the dominant relations of production, giving everything it touches, and this can include dereliction, poverty, and misery. The structure of a consumer good, even if the artwork's content is, on the face of it, politically opposed to those relations. So unless artworks are accompanied by a ruthless critique of their own relation to the process of capital accumulation, and a political rather than merely aesthetic struggle against those processes, they will have no other social function other than to amuse their audience with whatever happens to be the current political situation, artified and then fed back to them. In other words, simply to use political concerns as mere content filler, or alibi for their, or as an alibi for their existence and circulation as commodities, reduces the work's subject to a spectacle to be consumed voyeuristically. This can be done by a work that challenges its own status as object, but perhaps more effectively, also by taking back control of the context and surrounding narratives of the work and how it circulates. So that's stuff outside of the work, where you show it, and so on. There's a subtle delusion. I think we still loosely have it, even if people would say that they don't. Maybe it's a modernist hang-up that positions the work of art as some type of hermetic meaning generator that has no and needs no context. But there's always a conceptual framework for the work. There's no neutral setting. There's no neutral market or audience that can allow its autonomy, which I think everyone would agree with, but you'd be surprised at how often it comforts us to think that, or certainly as artists, to think that once an artwork leaves our studio, it's no longer our responsibility. So political content is not necessarily enough on its own to challenge art's status as the absolute commodity. As Benjamin wrote, the bourgeois apparatus of production and publication can assimilate an astounding number of revolutionary themes and even propagate them without seriously placing its own existence or the existence of the class that possesses them into question. So artworks validate money in more ways than one. So it's a comforting idea that merely reading or discussing critical theory is a radical act, and it's not. And it's cozy to think that the irony with which we might compromise our ethics or make our artwork might have some political vigor of its own. It doesn't. And it lets us off the hook when we believe that simply making artwork with radical themes is itself a radical act. It's not radical. It's become expected, and for the most part, no longer genuinely challenges the audience. So I believe that as artists and art world practitioners, we have to take back the responsibility for the dissemination of our work, for its context and the dialogue surrounding it. There's been some talk recently about post-capitalism and post-capital art. Maybe it's London-based discussions. I don't know if this reaches over here. I don't know what post-capital art would or could possibly look like, or how it would operate. But it sounds really fun, and I'd like to try it. The second video I'm going to show needs a bit more of a explanation, because it's an excerpt of a longer work in progress. So from this piece, you're going to miss a few kind of the nuances of who the character is, how we've ended up where we've ended up going on this micro tour. So apologies, but it seemed relevant to show it. It's also kind of a bit rough around the edges, and in the final edit I might be cutting it down a bit. The film is hopefully finished. Well, it's supposed to be finished now. It's not. It's called Tune In to Sanity FM, and I've called this excerpt Freeze. Before we play it, as you might be able to tell, I play in my films a certain character, which the more of my work you see, the more becomes apparent. It's essentially myself minus any redeeming qualities. So I'll ask your forgiveness before you say it. Thank you. Yeah.
In astrology, you don't just look at the one star. you look at its place in the whole constellation of stars. That's because symbols should be understood as being part of an ecology of signs. So in the case of art, it's never some free-floating meaning generator where it's shown, who it's shown by, sold to. It all constructs a framework of how people perceive things.
Reminds me, I used to work for a gallery being like an art handler, so I used to install all the artworks at this fair and stuff. And my old boss, she represents a lot of female artists, but she's not really herself a feminist. She used to bully a lot of the other female staff members and stuff. And she was once showing at an art fair this Hannah Wilkie photograph, and it's a picture of Hannah naked, and underneath it says, "What does this represent? What do you represent?" And she was showing it to some kind of like fancy collector guy, and he goes, "They obviously didn't know about female hygiene back then," you know, like ridiculing her pubic hair essentially. And instead of defending the politics of the work, this gallerist started to sort of like scoff with him, and started talking about how times have changed and the importance of women to look after themselves and stuff like that. I couldn't believe it.
Well, you know, as the saying goes, the master's tools we never dismantle the master's house.
Hannah Wilkie would be turning in her grave.
I mean, what's that? It's just stuff in a thingamajig.
Well, I think it's probably, you know, asking questions about its own sort of materiality and sort of questioning its own, you know, objectness and.
I'm so glad you're here to man-explain everything to me, Patrick.
Sorry. It's mansplain. It's like a portmanteau.
Don't do it, Michael, Patrick. Seriously.
Yeah, sometimes reading the press relief bump kind of helps contextualise things and.
It's like rebranding a merry-go-round as a horse tornado 5000. Britain is best. Oh, you have to take a photo of me, please.
Right.
Thank you. £4 for a cookie. Taking the piss or what? Listen, cover me while I tease this shit.
You can't steal from Gale.
Tune into Sanity FM, Patrick. There's no fucking Gale, just like there ain't no fucking Uncle Ben or Ronald fucking McDonald is.
I'm pretty sure there's a real Gale actually.
Fuck Gale. Listen, pussy hole, I'm making it quite bait, yeah, with your fucking face camera. Go and stand over there, man. I was reading an article recently. This whole art market is based around money laundering and tax evasion.
Yeah, old news.
And I've only just bloody robbed a cookie.
Yeah, I don't care if you want to rob a cookie, whatever. Not a big deal. But some people might say that it's a different category of crime. It's like a victimless crime or something. Not that I condone it.
Yeah, well, if punching someone in the dark is a victimless crime, then yeah.
Hello.
Ciao, Patrick.
How's it going? This is my friend Ravinda. Hi. See you when hell freezes over. Wish you'd heard me say that.
Because you're not an investor in your own right.
Magic, in its earliest form, was known as the art. You know, there's no difference between magic and art, really. I mean, you know, it starts off within the mind and then you manifest it in this physical realm. I mean, what the fuck's that? You know, in the bardic tradition, you know, of magic, the bard or the storyteller was considered more, you know, powerful than a sorcerer, you know. A sorcerer might jinx you, and, you know, your cow might die, or, you know, your child might be born with a funky hand. But if a bard was to curse you, what we consider as like a cuss, you know, these days, geez, man, you know, you're fucked. I mean, a story, a good story, could ruin your reputation, you know, your self-esteem, your pride in the eyes of this society. Do you know, you really do fit in the art world.
Yeah.
Yeah, you act as if, like, you know, you're anti-establishment and all that bullshit, but, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I probably do. I feel a bit ashamed.
It's all right to be ashamed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's fuck off.
Oh, love you.
Love you.
Playing it in front of real people instead of myself, I just thinking, oh God, that editing's a bit clumsy. And so just to contextualise a little bit, that's the film is like a 35-minute film following around a lady, Ravinda, who is a self-described witch, single mum, stoner, and East London empath, I think she says. Anyway, thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, real people. How you doing? We got a break, but first we have one more presentation. There was a word that was floating around, Anna brought it up, called the epiphenomenon, and maybe we'll get into this more later, but just to be crude about it, it's fancy Greek. For epi is before, phenomenon is how something becomes perceptible. Let's say an event, an action, or something like that, how it becomes visualized, how it becomes felt, and whatever. But what we've been talking about in Patrick's empath, talking about magic and things, made me think we're talking a little bit about the sorcery of the state or other forms of sorcery. But along those lines, what to think about with the epiphenomenon is that we're kind of discussing that there might be a sphere of things, either structures, activities, plans, conspiracies, and so on and so forth, that haven't been given voice to yet. They exist, but they're not yet really unconscious, and they're not really being discussed. And what part of the exhibition was trying to do, instead of thinking about objects as autonomous entities, or ideas, or narratives, or whatever you want to call them, but that there's actually sort of schism or sort of fight between how these different discrete things clash, and through clashing, whether it's many of the examples we've made, can break and create certain ways of seeing and viewing these before hidden narratives and so on and so forth. So really about encounters, but more radically when they disagree or when they show some sort of revealing structure or idea that was missing. So along those lines, we're going to take a radical departure and go to pretty much the definition of when things confront ideologies, which is specifically iconoclasm. And to this end, I'd like to invite up Fadi Abdallah from the International Criminal Court at The Hague. He is the head of the public affairs at the court, and he's going to discuss with us the recent case of Mahdi, who, well, I'll let you define who he is, but let's go.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Natasha, for inviting me here. I have to make a few precisions before I can discuss further issues with you. The first precision is that I lack the sense of humor of the first two speakers, so you'll have to bear with me. Well, I'll be speaking about more boring things and less artistic. Second precision, the final confirmation that I will be with you here was given only 2 days ago. So actually, I don't have something already prepared, but I will be more kind of thinking with you. The third precision is true that I'm the spokesperson of the ICC, but I mean, in order to discuss this type of things, I'm not speaking on behalf of the court. I'm sharing my personal views and, of course, some information that is actually accurate. Some. Now, the question that I was asked to consider is related to the case of Al-Mahdi. I know that Adam mentioned that it's related to Iconoclasm. I'm not sure if that is actually absolutely accurate, because we are not speaking about destruction of images, of icons, but more of monuments, buildings. So in this specific case, it is about the destruction of 9 mausoleums and 1 mosque. Well, actually not completely destruction in some cases, but attacking 9 mausoleums and 1 mosque in Timbuktu in Mali between June and July 2012. Mali is a state party to the ICC Rome Statute, so the ICC prosecutor could actually prosecute this, investigate this crime and prosecute the individual, Mr. Ahmed Al-Faqih Al-Mahdi, who pleaded guilty and later on was sentenced to 9 years of imprisonment for this crime. The crime is called a war crime, by the way, because it was committed in the context of a non-international armed conflict. It could have been also an international armed conflict, and it would have been also a war crime. But in this specific case, it was kind of more internal struggle between the government of Mali and some rebellion groups, including Ansar al-Din and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, ACME, and Mr. Al-Mahdi was close to these two militias. One thing that is, I think, important for me to share with you is that, specifically because we were speaking about the post-truth at a certain time earlier today, is this kind of specific relationship between law and truth. Of course, very often you would try to establish truth through a trial, and you need to establish, for example, for Mr. Al-Mahdi or for any other person to be convicted, we need to establish their responsibility beyond any reasonable doubt. But ultimately, law only takes one part of the truth, and it is the truth that is established and can be demonstrated by mechanisms that are acceptable by the law. So it's always a kind of only one part of the truth. It's truth that is established to a certain high level of credibility, but still it's only one part of the truth. The other element is that in any case, the law is interested only in some elements of reality and not in everything. If you have 2 cars that were that had an accident, then the speed of the car might be a relevant element for law. Whether the person that was driving was drunk or not is relevant for law. Not always the color of the car is something that is relevant. But for other elements, maybe the color is very important, but then it's not relevant for law. So the idea here is that law is always interested in some kind of truth, establishing some part of the truth, and taking only some elements of reality and not everything, which allows a kind of a competition or complementarity, depending on your own ideas, between law and art and social sciences. Because law will be building some kind of narratives. There is a narration, there is a story that has been established by the law, or that has not been established, because sometimes if there are no enough evidence, the person will be called innocent by justice, but in reality maybe he was not innocent, and maybe 10 years later there will be other evidence that will show that he was not innocent. But that's one element of this narration that is presented by the law. Another element is that the law archives a lot of documents, and it's very interesting for a lot of historians, for social scientists, but also for artists to use this material, this evidence, not only to question the matter of archive itself, but also to question the status of what is a document, what is an evidence, what narration can be possible, create alternative narrations, and so on. So it's only to invite you to get interested in the function of law, but when I'm speaking about law, I'm speaking about judicial institutions, actually. So not the theoretical concept of law, but more how in practice a big institution functions and what is producing during this functioning. I think is a source of a lot of interesting works in the last decade, maybe. And I think that it's a horizon that would be very interesting to explore further. Now, to return to the case of Mr. al-Mahdi, what has been taken into account for the ICC, for the International Criminal Court? It is first this crime, what we call a war crime. The war crime here is intentionally attacking monuments that are dedicated to religion or historic monuments. If you want, I can read to you, just because I think it's a bit important, a bit further on the definition of the crime. It's intentionally directing attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, provided they are not military objectives. And of course, this attack would have to be in the context and in relation to an armed conflict, in this case of a non-international character. The origin of this definition itself goes back in the time. I mean, this is part of the definition that has been accepted for the Rome Statute, the international treaty that created the ICC. But it existed already in the regulations of The Hague of 1907 and the 1919 Commission on Responsibility. Later on, it was taken on board also by the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols. And there is even older examples of similar prohibition related, for example, to the Instruction for the Government of Armies of the United States in the Field, 1863. And even we can go back further. I'm sure we can find in some ancient histories also similar ideas, but also it was part of the Islamic Sharia rules of law, this kind of prohibition. But you see that it's not related only to historic monuments. In this specific case, the case of al-Mahdi, what was very interesting is that the judges said these mausoleums and mosques are in the same time buildings dedicated to religion and historic monuments. So they are prosecuting the perpetrators of this attack against them. Alternatively and independently, they didn't need to say they are only historic monuments or only buildings dedicated to religion. It was somehow a combined qualification, which is sometimes possible for the judges. Another precision, we are not speaking about destroying these monuments. That's a difference between the ICC Rome Statute and the statute of the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for ex-Yugoslavia, that included a crime of destroying or destruction or willful damage to historic monuments and such buildings. So for the ICC, it's not necessary that the result is a destruction or a big damage. It's the intentional attack on these buildings that is sanctioned on itself. Of course, what the sentence would be is related to the gravity of the crime, but the constitution of the crime is happening at the moment that there is an intentional attack, independently of the end result for it. In this specific case also, something interesting happened is that the judges allowed organizations to participate as victims. So it's not, the system of the ICC is a bit different in the meaning that there is no claims or cases brought by the victims to the court. It's the prosecutor who decides to open the investigations and to decide on the crimes. But victims can participate in the proceedings after the case is opened. And in this case, the judges considered that certain individuals, but also certain organizations, have suffered a harm because of the destruction of these buildings. And the harm can be of a psychological nature, emotional nature, or economical nature. So that led the judges also to examine later on the impact of this destruction in the city itself, what kind of impact that has had. But that was in the context of examining the gravity of the crimes and not examining the constitution of the crime as a crime. So the conduct was qualified as a crime by the fact that there has been these intentional attacks against the buildings. Then the judges wanted to decide, okay, what would be the appropriate sentence in this case? Then they had to take different elements to check the gravity. And in checking the gravity, the judges highlighted several elements related to the importance of these monuments for Timbuktu itself, for the population of Timbuktu, because the population considered that these buildings, these mausoleums and mosques had a symbolic importance, offered a kind of protection to the city. There was a kind of annual ritual of symbolically maintaining them in which everyone of the city would participate. But there were also places for prayer, for pilgrimage, and places for benefit because of the people who would come to the city in order to visit these mausoleums and all the economic activity that can result from that. The judges also considered the question of these monuments being World Heritage, on the list of the UNESCO's World Heritage. Maybe I'm insisting too much, but for me it's important to say that being on the list of the World Heritage is not what constituted them as objects that deserve protection. But it was taken into account in deciding what is the gravity of the crime. So because of the importance of these monuments for the city of Timbuktu, and because of the importance of Timbuktu itself in the culture of the whole country of Mali, because Timbuktu is a kind of spiritual center, mainly because of these mausoleums and mosques and the manuscripts that has been preserved in Timbuktu, and the role that Timbuktu has played in the dissemination of Islam in this area of the world. So it was also important for, not only for the population of Timbuktu, but also for the whole population of Mali. And because it was considered as a World Heritage, then it was, their destruction resulted in a harm also for the international community and for the people who are interested in this culture. There is a cultural loss that goes beyond the frontiers or the borders of only the one country that we are speaking about, which is Mali in this case. Okay, so I think these were the main things that that I wanted to highlight as differences between elements of the crime and elements of the gravity. And the last thing that maybe we can highlight a bit is this status of an object in the eyes of the law, let's say. Basically, this protection of buildings dedicated to science, religion, education, medicine, or historic monuments is only one part of a more general protection of property, or what we call crime against property. So, for example, pillaging is also considered, depending on the cases, war crime or a crime against humanity. Here we have highlighted, so there's a general principle of not attacking civilian objects that are not military objectives. And then there is an additional layer of precision to say, okay, these are of a particular importance. So the buildings dedicated to art, education, science, religion, historic monuments, and so on. But that doesn't mean that in nature they are different from the others. It's just one category among the others. For example, to speak about crimes against individuals, you have in general the crime of murder. So murder or attacking civilians is a crime against humanity or a war crime depending on the circumstances. But then you have a bit of more specificities, like attacks on peacekeeping missions is considered also a war crime. So it is not that the peacekeepers become a distinctive category of the people. It's just an additional precision to incite the judges and the prosecutors to look into this matter. And that helps, for example, the judges in one of the decisions when they were discussing the criteria of the gravity to say, yes, there is specific precision for the peacekeepers. It's true that it was only 8 peacekeepers that were killed during this attack, which in normal cases you would say it's not grave enough for international justice to intervene. But because they were peacekeepers, because there is this specificity to say we want an additional protection for them, because it's indicated that if you are preventing the peacekeeping missions from fulfilling their own mandate, that means that the impact will go beyond the people that were directly affected, because then humanitarian aid will not be conveyed to the populations, because there will be no protection to this population from other violence and so on. So there are reasons. And here you can already see the reasons why there is a specificity for monuments that around which there is more investment from the community, whether it's symbolic or emotional or practical, like education, science, hospitals, and so on. So that status does not give the objects any specific rights on their own, which was one of the questions that Natasha was discussing. There is, I remember there was, and maybe it's still ongoing in France when I was studying there at the time, there was a debate about whether animals can have specific rights. Can you make, can a horse inherit from a man, for example? Can you legate a certain amount of your wealth to a horse after the death of the person, or does it have to go through a person who will be taking care of the horse? So it will be a condition to take care of the horse and to spend this money on this horse. So there has been a debate. For the objects, there is no specific rights for the objects. They are protected, but that does not give them the right. People cannot file cases on behalf of an object at the end. But people who own these objects or people who have suffered damage because of the destructions of these objects, whether this damage was, as I said, material, symbolic, emotional, or otherwise, can then participate into the proceedings and also seek reparations. For the case of Al-Mahdi, we are at the phase of reparations. So the judges have received certain observations from, or they are still seeking to seek further observations from the victims, so from the people who have participated or said that they have suffered this harm, from the community in general in Timbuktu, but also there has been international organizations and non-governmental organizations that wanted also to be authorized to participate into these proceedings as what we call amicus curiae, so the friends of the court, such as UNESCO, that wanted to offer this kind of precisions on the impact of the attack against these buildings outside of Mali and on the cultural aspects of that for, from an international perspective and not only from a local perspective. I think that was the main things. I hope that we still have the time to have the break. Yes?
Questions to supplement. What firstly, what were the reason? I'm just kind of tracking this back to an idea of epiphenomenon and how we can read these, the destruction of these mausoleums and the trials as a epiphenomenal event. What threat did the mausoleums pose to al-Mahdi and the people for whom he was operating? What was his reasoning for their destruction? And what was the urgency for the court to have prosecuted this case when it did, given that the case for prosecution is generated from within the court itself?
Okay, so for the court urgency, I mean, there is no specific argument that has been explicitly said by the prosecutor. The prosecutor opened the investigations upon the request of Mali. So the government itself asked the court to investigate what has happened, especially in the northern of Mali. And then the prosecutor has to select several cases and start investigating on these several cases. Based on the evidence that is gathered, the prosecutor can submit a request for an arrest warrant against the suspect or a summons to appear if the suspect is willing to appear voluntarily. In this case, Mr. al-Mahdi was already in detention in Niger, and then he was transferred from Niger to the ICC. Maybe there are other cases, I cannot say, and actually I don't know if there are other cases, but because the person has not been arrested yet, there has been no announcement about them. For example, for Mr. al-Mahdi, the announcement of the case was made after he has been transferred to The Hague. So I cannot know to which extent the other cases that are selected by the prosecutor has advanced and to which level, but this is only one element of one crime of others that are prosecuted in the context of Mali. It was also important because it's the first time that you have an international tribunal dedicating a trial specifically for the destruction of historic or religious buildings. In other cases before other tribunals like ICTY, they have been sometimes mentioning some attacks, but as an annex to another elements or to other crimes. Here, this was the only charge that was against him. So it was symbolically important for the court to say, this is a crime on its own and it has to end. Especially it came also in this wave of other attacks of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, also against historic and religious monuments there. Well, more historic than religious there. But it was important to have this kind of statement, this is a crime and this should not be accepted. And we had several messages together with the UNESCO on that element specifically. The other question about the threat that these monuments were to the ideology of Mr. al-Mahdi, I can have a double answer, let's say. The first answer is that according to the judges and to some witnesses, the idea of attacking these monuments was intended by the deciders of Ansar ad-Din and Al-Qaeda in Al-Maghrib in order to break the soul of the people of Timbuktu and break their attempts to resist their orders, basically. The people believed that these saints people offered a kind of protection for their city. And they had their own traditional Islam. And they were resisting, to a large extent, these measures that were imposed by what they conceived as a different conception of Islam or different interpretation of it. So there was this kind of threat that they symbolized the possibility of resist and saying no and offer a protection. But there is also another explanation, which is the reverse. Actually, the ideology that is, or the interpretation of Islam, let's say, that is adopted by Al-Qaeda in Al-Maghrib and by Ansar ad-Din and by certain other big powers in this area, is a threat to every historic monuments of that type, of the type of mausoleums and mosques that have a kind of aura of being saint and sacred. Because there are, of course, like for any religion, there are different conceptions or interpretation of the religion. For one branch, which is the branch of Al-Qaeda and all the other affiliated groups, the fact that there is anything other than God that is sacred is considered as, in Arabic you would say shirk, meaning believing in other gods than God. So the fact that you consider something as sacred, that means that you are already making it as equal to God. So in their conception, you cannot, for example, even consider the prophet as sacred. You cannot even ask the prophet help with something, which is something that's very common in the Islamic world, to call for help from the prophet or from his son-in-law and cousin Ali for the Shiite, and from the saint people and so on. So for this group of people, the mere fact of considering someone as sacred, or thinking that after death they value anything and can help you in any way, this is considered as a blasphemy in a certain way. And they find some elements of the prophet's sayings and conducts and so on to say these are historic examples and we need to destroy it. According to this rule, a mausoleum should not be higher than this from the floor. You should not venerate them, you should not build buildings and do pilgrimage around their tombs and so on. So basically I think this is the conception for them that of blasphemy, of creating false gods by doing that, and that's why they had destroyed these mausoleums. And similar things has happened in the past in other places of the world, like in Saudi Arabia in the beginning of the 20th century, by the Qaeda in Iraq and in Mali, as we mentioned.
So we're going to have a 15-minute break now. There's coffee and tea outside, and then we'll restart for the second half.
Ooh. Hello. Welcome back. I thought I should probably say what this is because it's been up here the whole time. For those of you who have not been upstairs, it's one of the works in the exhibition. It's by an artist named Britomaka Laba. And what it's depicting in 1980, there's a transnational group of people called the Sami who live in the Nordic regions, stretching across 4 countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. They predate these countries. These countries have, analogous to other indigenous struggles around the world, in which they ultimately became part of, were subject to, particularly in Norway, a process called Norwegianization, in which their lands were taken over. They were trying to strip them of their language by taking children and putting them in boarding schools and breaking up the family, trying to break up the religion and their ways of life. But more pertinently, and a lot of other evil things before that, but more pertinently in 1980, as per Norway's desire to open up the Arctic region, they wanted to build a hydroelectric dam in an area called Finnmark, which is the northernmost province of Norway. And a group of artists actually centered around a village there called Matsi, which was going to be flooded by the lake that would be created by the dam. got together and formed not only a spearhead of a burgeoning protest movement, but also developed the iconography and the symbolism that they would use for that. And in particular, what's depicted here, this is an embroidery, it's quite lovely, is actually the showdown between the Norwegian police and the Sami people, who did a two-pronged action in which they hunger struck in front of the parliament in Oslo and chained themselves to the construction site where the dam was supposed to be in Alta. And this is actually, of course, documenting the Sami on the right and the police, and you can look at the image in ways you want, but ultimately they lost. The dam was constructed, the protest was broken up. However, this event spurred sort of Sami movement transnationally, but specifically in Norway as well, that actually led one of the main activists, a guy named Nilas Sambi, he had to go in exile because he was arrested. He actually blew up part of the construction site to impede the dam. He went in exile into Canada and joined up with First Nations there. And together, collectively, they worked with the UN to make the first declaration on Indigenous rights. So it's a kind of happy story and not happy story at the same time. But moving along, we're going to show more work, some more film. So I'd like to introduce or invite up to join us Kapwani Kiwanga to give a little introduction and show us a film. Yeah, thanks. I think that was it.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for all coming, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I was quite happy as I was came a bit later on in the day to hear the different kind of, I guess, cornerstones have been put down by different participants. Because I think the short extract that I'm going to show you of a video today touches on a few of those ideas. I'm an artist who is originally from Canada, and I'm now living in Paris, France. I'll mention I'm doing a bit of a biography just so it makes a bit of sense, a bit of my methodology and also the video I'm going to show. I studied anthropology and comparative religions for a short period of time. And that was an interesting but also an uncomfortable place for me to be. And in my work, I think there's something of kind of exercising that experience in terms of working a lot with narrative. Narrative is recurrent in my work, and also this question of objects that end up being witnessed, but the objects that are witnessed are often ephemeral objects, things which through time or through elements end up changing state, I guess. And I mentioned the uncomfortable moments of being in the academic world because of the narratives that are circulated in this question of knowledge production. And so in the video I'm going to show you extracts of now, what I do, which is a method that comes with other work as well, is that I take these narratives which are more hegemonic or that are quite playing with the power, and we talked a lot about that with the first intervention, and I do kind of the opposite of what one of the characters in Patrick's video said, and by quoting Audre Lorde, and I do use the master's tools to try to take away the master's house. And so I really inhabit those narratives, so I will use conspiracy theory or scientific language or tone to try to just make it evident that those are in fact mechanisms and ways in which to create power imbalances, etc. So I try to inhabit them to pull them apart, but I think also because it's also difficult for me to completely extract myself from those structures that have actually formed me as well, although it's a continual struggle. So what you will see in this video called The Secretary Suite are kind of the bookends of this video. So there's the first bit of it and the last. And it came out of an invitation that I had to do a work in the United States, and I went to the United Nations. I was interested in the question of diplomatic gift giving. also in this idea of gift giving, not strictly in an economic realm, but more in its bypassing that and in creating webs of relations and indebtedness. So that idea of debt come back again. And I visited the United Nations, and I was lucky enough to be taken around by some people working with the art collections there, and who showed me some of the objects that were gifted to the UN. And I thought I was going to follow on that path and work really with the objects that were part of the collection. And as with any kind of work, it kind of takes up its own path. And I ended up coming across a image which took me. And the image was a photograph taken of a portion of Dag Hammarskjöld's office. And Dag Hammarskjöld was the UN Secretary of State up until 1961. And this image, for me, ended up being somewhat of like a stage set for lots of different stories that were rallying around in my head. And I used a kind of tone of an investigative or conspiracy theory in which I was looking at different evidences within that image to try to unravel the mystery behind Dag Hammarskjöld's death. The video itself speaks about that a bit, so what I will do now is show some extracts of that, and I'd be happy to respond a bit more at the plenary at the end in relation to that. So if we're ready, I guess we could have a look at that now. Thank you. This photo was taken on September 1st, 1961, in New York City. It depicts the suite of the United Nations' Second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld. It was taken 17 days before Hammarskjöld perished in a plane crash outside of Ndola, in the British Protectorate of Northern Rhodesia, our present-day Zambia. Various official inquiries into the Secretary General's untimely death tried to determine the cause of the crash. Conclusions ranged from pilot error to eyewitness accounts that claimed the plane had been shot down by another aircraft. Speculation persists around the incident, leading some to believe that the Secretary General was in fact assassinated. Numerous inconclusive commissions resulted in General Assembly Resolution 1759 of October 26, 1962. It requests that the Secretary General inform the General Assembly of any new evidence which may come to the Secretary's attention regarding the Hammarskjöld incident. Let us deflect our investigative impulses away from the crash site to another research terrain, one which lies 12,000 kilometers away from Ndola, in New York City. Let us take a closer look at our first image, the Secretary's Suite. On the left-hand side of the wall, one finds a bust depicting Lakshmi, the Hindu goddess of fortune and prosperity. Offered by India, it is an example of a diplomatic gift. That is to say, a gift presented by a diplomat, politician, or leader when visiting a foreign country. Hammarskjöld, whose family had long served the Swedish court, would have certainly been well versed in such protocolar gifts. When looking at the vast collection of 17th century silver works given by Swedish monarchs to Russian czars, one cannot help but wonder if one of Hammarskjöld's relatives was not directly involved in the endowment of at least one of these objects. One can begin to imagine the immense breadth of objects offered throughout history to seal relationships between different groups. As we cannot be exhaustive, let us focus on but a few examples. Not necessarily the most emblematic, but prone to the narrative's subjective discrimination. When Constantine V gave Pepin the Breath of the Franks a pipe organ as a gift in 757, he was also demonstrating Byzantine cultural and technological superiority. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the pipe organ continued to exist in the East, but was absent from the West from the end of the 5th century to the middle of the 8th century. Constantine's gift sows the seeds of Western church music. For just a century later, the first European organ was built in Aachen, a Roman Catholic cathedral in Western Germany, by Pepin's son, Charlemagne, establishing the organ at the core of Western church music. Not all diplomatic gifts are testaments to material or technological artistry. A case in point can be found in 1923, when the Netherlands offered 300,000 flowers to be planted in the Jardin des Tuileries in Paris, France. On occasion, political personalities will choose to erect museums to display gifts received whilst they were heads of state. The former French president, François Mitterrand's collection of gifts are housed in the Museum of Septenant in the town of Château-Chinon. A golden mask from Gabonese President Omar Bongo sits in the company of an incense burner, a gift by Saudi Arabia. Often destined to impress and honor their beneficiaries, these gifts may have symbolic or protocolar import, but are not without market value. A group of professionals recognized the collection's purely economic value, and in 2015 successfully stole the equivalent of 500,000 euros of gifts from the museum's collection. Speaking to the museum's director, François Martin, on the telephone, he was seated at his desk in the process of writing letters to the concerned embassies to inform them that their ambassadorial offerings had been removed from the realm of diplomacy and were now likely circulating in an illicit market. In these museum collections, one not only finds diplomatic gifts, but also those of a more popular nature, drawings by schoolchildren or homemade objects, such as this knitted cap by Madame Ghislaine Ferron. Although a depiction of a deity, the Lakshmi bust represents the only human form amongst the various objects found in the Secretary's suite. It unwittingly calls to mind another aspect of diplomatic gifting, that of offering other humans as gifts. It is not uncommon for people to be given explicitly as consorts to foreign emissaries. Malinche, a historic personality imbued with plenty of legend, is one case in point. Born sometime between 1496 and 1501, she was one of 20 female slaves given to the Spaniards by the inhabitants of Tabasco in 1519. She later became the interpreter and mistress of Hernan Cortes, giving birth to his first son, Martin. Most concur that she was instrumental in the Spaniard conquest of the Aztec Empire. For this she is sometimes remembered with disdain, and her name can be synonymous with treachery or disloyalty. Others are more forgiving in their memory of her, and see her as the figurative progenitor of Mexican people. Marriages of state are unions between two members of different nation-states, or between two power blocks. They were political in nature and sealed international relations, avoided war, and maintained peace. Evidence of such nuptial agreements goes as far back as early Grecan culture in Western society, and of similar antiquity in other civilizations. One such marriage of state occurred between Tadu Hepa, daughter of King Tushratta of Mitanni, in what is present-day northern Syria, and the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC. Perhaps the first item which captures the eye, but the last to which we now turn, is a leopard skin rug lying in the foreground. A gift from northern Nigeria, it calls to mind the long history of animals as diplomatic gifts. In 1827, Muhammad Ali, the Viceroy of Egypt, gave away 3 giraffes, one to King George IV of Britain, a second to Charles X of France, and a third to Franz II, Emperor of Austria. In May 1827, the gift of George IV boarded the Penelope Malta, which had a hole cut in the deck to accommodate the passage of the animal's neck. After several weeks, it arrived in Windsor. The giraffe died in early October 1829, and the king shortly after, in June 1830. In 1515, Manuel I, King of Portugal, sent a rhinoceros as a gift to Pope Leo X. At the time, a rhinoceros had not been seen in Europe since Roman times. The animal had been boarded onto a ship which was wrecked in a sudden storm off the coast of Italy in 1516. The rhinoceros, which had been chained to the deck, was unable to swim to safety and drowned. A white elephant named Hanno had already been given by King Manuel I to Pope Leo X for his coronation in 1514. 2 years after it came to Rome, the animal fell ill and died on the 8th of June, 1516. Hanno does not appear to be a white elephant in the metaphoric sense of the term. This metaphor refers to Thai kings who would give sacred white elephants, which required special care, to unwanted courtiers in order to ruin them financially. The leopard rug points to more intrigue than one would initially expect. The leopard print becomes synonymous with Joseph Désiré Mobutu, military strongman and president of the Democratic Republic of Congo from 1965 to 1997. Mobutu is often pictured with a leopard skin hat. Another Congolese politician, Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of independent Congo, was intermittently pictured with a leopard skin hat. Here the affinities between Mobutu and Lumumba end. Lumumba was imprisoned and executed by firing squad in 1961, when Mobutu overtook the government in a military coup. Lumumba had asked Hammarskjöld for assistance in quelling the Katanga separatists, but Hammarskjöld had refused. Lumumba reached out for Soviet support, which led him to become vulnerable as he lost both internal and international support. Returning to the photo one last time, one cannot help but see it as a premonition, a Cassandra image, which prophetically unravels the mystery of Hammarskjöld's death and the overriding diplomatic and political context. But what is one to do with such a clairvoyant image? One could submit the photo in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 1759 as hitherto overlooked evidence to help unriddle the circumstances of the crash of September 18th, 1961. And if this document proves too speculative for the General Assembly's consideration, let us then be content to have become better acquainted with some pertinent fragments of histories which bind nations and groups in a web of relations. So that was a kind of a fast forward of a longer piece, and I go through all of the different elements in the image, and I kind of take them apart as evidence to different evidences towards the Hammarskjöld's disappearance. And what I think I'd like us to pick up on, perhaps in the plenary, is this cohabitation of conspiracy / scientific tone, and that of more magical or oracular sayings as well, which work together as kind of two different intelligences, I think, that are important to have together. Okay, so thank you. And
thank you, Kapwani. And now I'd like to welcome Anke Bangma, who will carry on this idea of witnessing objects in their changing states. And just as Kapwani created this kind of video archive or encyclopedia of images, we're going to return to another form of archive to read photography as an apparatus and trace of colonial power structures, which can be disrupted through new modes of reading. So take it away, Anke.
Thank you, Natasha, for that beautiful introduction. If I feared that there was no bridge between what happened before and what I could add, then at least you solved that for me. I do think I'm going to take you a little bit into a different world, and for me it's also a trip back into a world that I left 6 weeks ago to become a bit of its neighbor. But it links to some of the thoughts and reflections that I've had during the last couple of years when I worked at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, first as a curator of contemporary art and then also as a curator for the photography archive of the museum. And there is a particular album of images in that archive that prompted some reflections that stuck with me and that I proposed to contribute today. It does relate somewhere to some of the things that were mentioned: politics, power, resistance. Maybe it brings us back also to the question of maybe there is any power in appearance after all, and questions of how recent or very old manipulation of images is. This is album number 2292 from the archive of the Tropen Museum. It's rather small, something like that, and not very spectacular at first sight. But for me, it did become something like that recollection image that Deleuze describes as a radioactive fossil. Once encountered, at least once I encountered these images, such images, these radioactive fossils, make it undeniable that there may be other histories or experiences that are contradictory to the ones you've come to know, and that thus make your perceptions of the past and preconceptions in the present untenable, or at least unstable. This is one of the images from album 2292. The historical photography collections of museums like the Tropen Museum or other ethnology museums around Europe are usually described as ethnographic or colonial, and they are both terms which I've come to know as complex and contested, and that I've come to consider in equal measures as helpful, as critical frames, but also as obfuscating in many ways, and I'll come back to that. To call photographs colonial is to recognize the role they have played in establishing a colonial imagination or worldview, and as an instrument of measuring, identifying, and governing bodies and things within colonial states and economies. And to call photographs ethnographic is to recognize them as part of a history of a Western scientific and popular obsession with knowledge and power, knowledge of and power over people and cultures, by means of a codification of cultural difference, which of course in the 19th and 20th century was very much entwined with the colonial imagination. So the paradigm of that genre of photographic archive that I found myself in over the past years has long been the stereotype. I chose deliberately not to show you a stereotype today. I don't know if I might regret that later. I have regretted before showing stereotypes first. That stereotype, maybe in contemporary vocabulary, you could call it a kind of ethnic profiling, a practice of classifying people into distinct cultural and racial groups based on visual appearance. Early photography perhaps was the perfect tool for that kind of construction of ethnic type, because of course there was such long exposure times that it was impossible to make any spontaneous pictures in the chaos and messiness of outdoors everyday life. And hence, images of people were constructed in the studio, or at least in staged settings, by means of costumes and props, pose and backdrops. Real people then were molded into a theatrically constructed cliché image. I'll take my references from Indonesia because that's what this material is also for. So there the cliché images would be the Dayak, the Karo Batak, etc. Often literally labeled like that by an imprint on the image. And as some of you may know, post-colonial writing on photography has thoroughly dissected the implications of this type of stereotype and pointed at the asymmetries of power enacted by them, the uses of photography as instruments of surveillance, discipline, and control, and the violence of representation. And each of those aspects of the historical role of photography outside the West are undeniably real. But are they the only story? That's what this image asked me. The image you've been looking at is a photograph of a Javanese king, Chokonegoro III, made sometime between 1900 and 1910. I found versions of this image that was labeled as 3 Javanese rulers, but by the time that I've arrived at this point, maybe you had recognized yourself that it's actually one person, Chokonegoro III, performing 3 versions of himself in one image. The image was a gift to a Dutch colonial high officer, and there are more than 3. There are 3 more. And more. And more. And more. 1900, 1910, yeah, that's significant because I've shown these pictures to very young people and they don't think there's anything special about this kind of self-performance through montage, but this is really early. So these portraits are part of a series of composite images of multiple selves that are constructed with the very same elements of early photography that I mentioned as key to the ethnographic stereotype. Costume, prop, pose, and backdrop are here worked into collages that were then rephotographed and printed. So on the actual images, it's one surface, so they must have been rephotographed. You see the seams, but you don't see actual layerings of cuts. An album, 2,292, contains 7 of such photo montages with, in total, 20 different guises of Chokonegoro. And we know there are more of those photo montages in some other archives. I found 2 more in Dutch archives, and we have no clue what might be found in Indonesia. So this whimsical use of photomontage to perform multiple selves is quite rare and startling at first. It really does, of course, not fit the idea of the stereotype, which is, after all, about one single cliché image that should stand in for an entire group of people, and that should make cultural difference and diversity clear and manageable. This type of image also doesn't fit the idea that early photography would be a Western technology that was only cast onto others, or at best adopted by others as an extension of an internalization of Western paradigms. And maybe that is why these images in the archive of the Tropenmuseum were known but long discarded, as if they couldn't quite be taken seriously. So they would sometimes be brought up from the digital database to have a laugh in the lunch break, but they wouldn't be researched or exhibited. and maybe it's a stupid association, but I'm addicted to Westworld at the moment, and there we have these robots that when they get shown a picture of the real world outside, they say, I don't see anything, because they're not programmed to see something there. Maybe that's a little bit what the response tended to be to these pictures. But if one cares to look, actually the performance of multiple selves is in itself not an exception amongst portraits of Javanese rulers. Here's an example of 40 years earlier. Not in one image, but there is a series of portraits in our archive alone of the Susuhunan Pakabumanu IX, a little bit earlier, who we see in Javanese royal regalia. And here, actually, if you see in the same studio, if you look at the podium he's sitting on, in Western garb, complete with top hat on the table, or in Arab gear, perhaps for Friday visits to the mosque. So just encountering these images, and that's why I start from those, kind of posed a problem. What to do with these images, how to read them, how to understand why they were made, what they could have been doing and intending. And I think actually this changing of clothes that you see, this game of dress, is key to understanding to what might be at stake. And an important source of inspiration for how I came to look at these images was John Pemberton's wonderful book on the subject of Java. And though he doesn't speak at all about photography in that book, he does describe with beautiful literary detail and humor how a core element of the response of the Javanese rulers to the interventions of Dutch colonial powers in their territory and their affairs was a tactics of dress. Dressing Dutch, which we also see Chokonagoro do in part in his photomontages, was not, as one might have expected, a protocol imposed by the Dutch colonial regime. And it's also not sufficiently explained, as is sometimes suggested, as a colonization of the body on behalf of the Dutch, or an effort to please the Dutch powers on behalf of the Javanese aristocracy. In fact, the Dutch much preferred the Javanese rulers to look as Javanese as possible, so that they would be Orientalist and other, and that things Javanese could be neatly separated from the Dutch regime. But many Javanese rulers actually did the opposite. They appropriated and absorbed Dutch influences, most notably in their clothes. And a nice example of how Dutch dress was appropriated is the short coat that you see here on the right. And it actually features in a range of pictures. I found it in other places in the archive as well. And it's also nice, not just because of the way it looks, but because the story is known of how it came into being. This jacket was the creative initiative of one of the Javanese rulers, Prince Mangkunagara IV, taken in 1871, when he had to visit the opening ceremony of a kind of country palace of one of the other rulers, and he wasn't sure what kind of costume was appropriate. The story goes that as a solution, he took a Dutch waistcoat and cut off the tails. What do you call this kind of coat in English? You know, very formal, do you know, the penguin jacket, let's say. Exactly. So, cut off the tails so that he could show the cuirass, the dagger that you wear on the back above your batik normally. And rather than wearing European trousers with the coat, he combined his adaptation of Western formal wear with the finest batik. All his royal servants were made to wear the same thing. They showed up at the party, and as Pemberton describes in the type of beautiful vocabulary that he uses, this roki javi, as it was called, became the fashion statement of the 1870s and became a very popular element of formal Javanese wardrobe ever since. So what happens here is that the Dutch elements that the Javanese elite adopted, top hat, trousers, socks, shoes, stockings, etc., they didn't replace a Javanese style, but instead they became a component of and an extension of a Javanese style, a style that had, as you can see in the multiple versions of Chokonegoro, already absorbed many other influences in the past from other parts of the world. Of course, Indonesian societies had always been rather open systems, and influences from abroad and their local appropriations and interpretations were already an integral part of their local culture. And through a long history of trade and contact, Javanese culture and dress had already absorbed influences from China, India, Portugal, Arab cultures, etc. So the appropriation of Dutch elements added to, rather than cut back, these rulers' repertoire of choices. And so hence they would literally, like we saw here, wear Javanese dress for one day, Dutch for the other, Arab clothes on Friday, and a mix of clothes at any other occasion they liked. And going back to these photomontages, it struck me that perhaps the technology of photography allowed Chokonogoro to play exactly with putting this kind of repertoire of choices on stage in one image, amplifying it into a simultaneous multiplicity rather than a change of clothes at different subsequent occasions. Now, it's important to remember that these portraits were made at a time when the Dutch increasingly limited the power and the movement of the Javanese rulers. It had been customary for the Javanese rulers to travel and inspect their territory at least once a year, but by the early 19th century, they weren't even allowed to leave their kraton, their palace, without permission of the Dutch governor. So, even though the Dutch residents had this colonial system of indirect rule where they relegated some powers to the Javanese royalty by appointing them as regents, they had literally taken control of the king's every movement. Effectively, that meant they were immobilized, confined to the palace, except for the regular, obligatory ceremonial procession from the kraton to the colonial administrative center to pay respect to the Dutch regent. So the entire governmental power of Javanese rulers was effectively, and especially after the Javanese War, the Java War, reduced to ceremonial theater. But ceremony, and this is something Pemberton suggests, but it also became apparent in conversations I had with artist Jompet Kuswidenantu, who I made an exhibition with. Ceremony is not as insignificant as it may sound. In the highly regulated nature of court life, ritual and ceremony also became a stage in which power relations were continuously enacted, circumvented, resisted, and refashioned. And Pemberton beautifully recalls how some regions, on the day that they were required to march from their own palace to the palace of the Dutch regents, would perform what he calls a ritual no-show by sending some servants instead of going themselves. There's also a very striking account by a reporter of the time, so in the early 19th century, who noted how this kind of play of roles would act out every time that there was a ceremony. I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly, Garibeg, but the procession, which is actually a procession of gratitude to Allah for the prosperity and the crops. But the Dutch resident would have to attend this kind of ceremony, so effectively he would have to comply with thanking Allah for something that happened on their grounds. In turn, the Dutch residents instituted a new component to this ceremony, this procession, by making sure that the route was changed so it would start in the palace of the Javanese kings, but it would end in the palace of the Dutch regent with a toast, forcing this Islamic ruler to drink alcohol. So it's a continuous play of ceremony and of kind of finding the space within that to make the other part of your rules of the game. And it's that world in which these photographs came into being. So while the Dutch governors were intent on shrinking and this kind of played into my reading of what might be at stake in these images. So on the one hand, while the Dutch governors were intent on shrinking the physical and political world of the Javanese rulers, perhaps their multiple guises point to something else. First of all, and Pemberton suggests this as well, royal cross-dressing was a privilege that the Dutch governors could never enjoy. It was unthinkable that a Dutch regent would show up in royal Javanese gear at an official occasion, whether the opposite did happen. So the Javanese rulers could do something the Dutch could not. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, something interesting is at stake in the way the Javanese, as opposed to Dutch identity markers, become played out in these clothes. Karawailandi, Dutch style, as the Javanese called it, was considered the other, the opposite of Karajawi, Javanese style, but they weren't opposites of a similar nature. There is actually an evasion of the logic of us and them at stake, because while Karawailandi is understood to be one thing, the Dutch dress, perhaps equivalent to the notion of the singular stereotype that the Europeans were so attached to, Karajavi, per definition, is many things. It is that mix of styles, that repertoire of choices, which Pemberton calls cross-dressing, but which I've heard in the Indonesian context more often called syncretism. So the appropriation of Dutch elements, in combination with the other elements that had already been appropriated over a period of time that far stretched beyond the relatively recent period of Dutch rules, was a means to draw the foreign into the Javanese world. So in those terms, adopting Dutch elements of style is not, as I said before, a bowing to the power of the Dutch colonial hegemony, but to some extent at least, an act of symbolically domesticating Dutch influence. Having the choice to adopt Javanese dress for one day, Dutch for another, Arab costumes for Friday, or a deliberate mix of styles, is perhaps also a means of signaling a connectedness to a different geography than the Dutch colonial empire. So instead of suggesting that you're only part of a Dutch regime, actually all these connotations in these clothes suggest a broad sphere of influence, a sphere of influence that was definitely cultural and spiritual, and to some extent also economic and legal. So, to conclude, within this line of thought, the whimsical photomontages of Tjokonegoro III to me suddenly became not an oddity in the photo archive, but perhaps the ultimate example of a practice that had a much wider spread and that definitely had vast implications. The photomontages are definitely an instance of self-making, of interaction, and of subtle resistance, however ceremonial. Playing with photomontage was a smart move on behalf of Tjokonegoro III, within a ritual game that was already invested in inhabiting a cultural space that wanted to define itself as a repertoire of influences and spheres of influence. And here, perhaps, the detail that this little album that we had in the archive was a gift becomes important. So with all this rethinking of what these images might mean in mind, suddenly to imagine that actually here's a man who had these portraits made of himself, had an album made of it, he signed it. So in that sense, he really authored these photographs, and then he gave them as his relational gift to the Dutch colonial officer. He wanted this to be disseminated into the world of power in that way. Of course, part of my reading of album 2292 is speculation, perhaps even projection, and I haven't even had the time to kind of make a real archaeology of what all the different lives of these different figurations of Tjokonegoro might have been, and of how many multiplications of these photographs, which is after all a medium of reproduction, might have spread around in the world and where. We also may never really know what motivated or what thoughts the receivers of these gifts would have had and how they understood them to mean something to them. But within the archive of the museum itself, this kind of tiny, seemingly unimpressive album that I started with really was something that stuck out like a radioactive fossil, and that started destabilizing all kinds of other established understandings. The ethnographic and colonial archive, to conclude, is often seen, and to a large extent rightly so, as a repository of ways in which the West has attempted to capture and control others. But Tjokonegoro's composite images and multiple selves form one instance in a range of images in which it's evident that photography was also appropriated as a medium in different locations to do very different things, and that it's actually a performative tool. It's not registering anything, it's not truth-speaking anything in that sense. It's an event that performs a reality and that disseminates that reality in the world, that's what it wants to do. And that's also a testimony to actually this person or the people around him understanding in 1910 what the technology of photography could do, and not understanding at all in those Western cliches of objectivity or a Western technology that was used to make others behave in the ways that West wanted them to behave. Maybe that's enough. Thank you.
So I'd like to invite all the speakers back up for the plenary and Q&A, moderated by Adam Kleinman.
All right. Hi, everyone. We're almost done. We're winding down here. And I mean, it's a rather small group. So obviously, we're going to open it up to the audience, and feel free to interject. I'm just going to be a little bit more of like a traffic cop and try to lead the discussion if it needs to, but it would be wonderful, of course, if anyone has any questions and so on, to return. Decided to just change the images up, and this is some of the cutting room floor from Anna's talk. You want to give a very quick talk of why you assembled these things?
Yeah, sure, but I don't know myself. I mean, I'm not a connoisseur of John Not's work, you know, the painter above, but the painting where he shows like all the American people in chains, that one, you see the forgotten man is the only one that is kind of like trying to break free from his chains. Everybody else is applauding Obama, who is obviously a symbol of like political wickedness. And the other images that Adam wanted to share with you, I collected a couple of like Nazi propaganda posters, and they all show happy Nazis. In the sense that I thought that it was important to highlight this, that of course this identification, this ideological identification is always a positive identification. You know, it's not, one has to see that these are images that campaign on this ideas of like domesticity, like the family, you know, like a happy familial bond, like the bond of women and children, but also like, for instance, this one is trying to collect money for orphans and youth in peril. And then there's another one, this is a campaign in the UK, so basically work and bread, you know, it's like the promise of the UK branch of the Nazi party. And I think that one cannot dismiss this positive aspect of ideology. So basically one can, you know, like it's not, it would not capture so many people, it would not capture so much enthusiasm if it would be like only like tapping into this to this reservoir of negative feelings or hostility. But I really don't want to.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
No, just to change the imagery. Maybe go back to what is the painter's name? Knox. John Knox? No, that's a Calvinist.
Yeah, the painter.
His name's John Knox?
Norton.
Oh, Norton, okay.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Oh, okay, it'd be amazing if his name's John Knox. No, it's just to throw up some other things, but in particular, who maybe knows, there's the art historian that Carlo Ginzburg was particularly interested in, an Italian 19th century art historian. Who is it again? Yeah, Morelli, who, for those of you who don't know, I'll do a little brief introduction. For those of you who do, please bear with me and bring some more precision, to borrow a term. But he had mentioned that the classical way of looking directly at an image was probably wrong, and focusing on the centerpiece wouldn't really give you any information. It would just tell you what the artist or whomever was trying to delineate. And he said what you should really do is actually look to the margins, look at what the hands are doing, look at what the ancillary characters are doing, and then from there you can construct, and it's before Freud and all of this kind of stuff, but you can construct other sort of hidden ideas or actual agendas that are going on. And that's why I particularly liked to bring these up, because of course there's the centerpiece and the idiocy of having Jesus Christ hold a document that basically says explicitly that religious texts are invalid. So he's anti-constitutional. That's not how he sees it, but I don't know, I can read pretty well. But really, if you look at the sort of the margins, you can see a little bit of what's going on here. And in particular, on the one on the top, you have a dichotomy between the good mother and the bad mother. And they're both in blue, which of course is Mary too, if you really want to go for it. But of course, one is pregnant, and one could assume, since she's on the side of the bad and next to a justice, that they're somewhat hinting at abortion legislation, whereas the woman on the right, who's obviously, or stage, right, who's on the side of the good, which is, you know, the Marine and all of this kind of stuff, had birth. So there's a hidden idea of you know, pro-life and so on and so forth. And there's other ways too. If you notice who's behind Obama, you see what looks like a Saudi, which is quite interesting. Yeah, I can't tell if it's who it
and
is.
King Yo-Hil is over there in that corner. You cannot see it, but he's also behind Obama.
Right, and that there's the Forgotten Man has a cock next to him.
We don't know why.
We don't know. I think we do. But anyway, I mean, the whole point of that is these sort of encapsulate some of the things we've been talking about and we're trying to do in the exhibition. And Anke, I think you're borrowing from Deleuze, where you said this radioactive fossils. And if people have looked up in the show, we have a work by Susan Kreeman specifically on irradiated materials from a uranium mine. And similarly, we have the first ever photographs of subatomic particles, which we were using as sort of a metaphor. So instead of, and again, maybe return to this epiphenomenon thing, but this idea, you know, that there is something that happens, let's say, and before I said there was maybe these subterranean currents or whatever, but that information is bleeding out of all of these things. And what, to borrow from what you were saying before with law, is that that there are, not that there's multiple realities, not to use that term, but that the law is a system in which concentrates a specific reality, and then that reality gets imposed through, as you were saying with the case, was mapping the litigious nature of the court and how things can be epistemologically and juridically defined. So I mean, to spin it out of images a bit, and I think we should talk a little bit about optics because it's pretty important, but we almost have this sort of thing going on where, you know, it's really competing of narratives and how things or events are going to be termed and defined. And the real question, you know, is what is the power behind what then inscribes a narrative, when there's obviously a possibility to take many. You look like you're itching, Patrick.
No, just say, with these paintings, it's our interpretation of them is totally sort of biased because we know who they're given to, and where and in what context they might be shown. Obviously, when you look at the details, we can start seeing, you know, more acute. But you know, minus maybe the Marine or like a few other sort of things. If we had been told that they'd been removed by Donald Trump from, or they'd been painted by some sort of like radical left, it wouldn't have been. But who it's given to, we're then told that it has this sort of like obviously perhaps right wing. So in traditional sort of like Marxist jargon, he talks about the lumpen proletariat, which I'm still unaware as if it's a derogatory term or not. But he said that the lumpen proletariat doesn't have any revolutionary potential and that they're more likely to be co-opted by the right. Obviously, like the anarchists sort of like hugely disagreed, so that these sort of, and that's the kind of the forgotten man. If we were told that these paintings were painted by some type of like anarchist who viewed Obama as being some like terrible neoliberal, you know, demon, then you know. Anyway, but maybe not. Just throwing it out there.
I think that you also have to notice like the you know, like the form. You know, it's not just a matter of competing narratives. I would just see it a bit differently, a little bit like competing forms. Like, for instance, I would see this like in opposition to the film you just shown. So basically, like here, you know, like when you talk about conspiracy theory, I think that it all comes to the fore. You know, like this. The explicitness of all the theme and content, no, like there is really no attempt to interpret. There is like no possibility, you know, like there's no semantic indeterminacy. There is no slippage, no, like everything is like over explicit. And I think this is what is interesting about this. You know, like it's also of course like. You know, like what is typical of like propaganda, no, like all the, you know, like what is typical of all the imagery that is produced as propaganda.
We're speaking about form. I'm just taken by the color palette and what that kind of harks back to. I'm not an expert at all in American historical paintings, but I think in the creation of national identity and narratives, it really kind of speaks to me in that way. So, yeah, I think the anarchists might have a different color palette, but they might have the same figures though.
Yeah, stylistically, obviously, it's radically different. It's kind of not as vague as I'm sort of choosing to allude to it as being. But there is room in these. I mean, maybe this is a bad example, but I'm just saying that there is room for ambiguity, and the context. You know, it was very important when you introduced it, saying the painter gave it to Donald Trump, and we all go, ah, you know, and in that instant we totally see it in a very specific guise. That sort of way of seeing it turns out to be correct when you look at the background characters, but that's sort of almost incidental to my point. Thank you.
But I mean, oh, it's gone. Hello? Oh, hi. But that's maybe a question to bring up that's also floating in the room, is really the question of dissemination and broadcast. And so much of everything is defined on context, which Anke was telling us quite beautifully, who this was intended for, and why and how. And I mean, this is addressed to everyone, but maybe particularly our artists on the panel. How do you think about that in relation to who will view it when? You even made the funny comment that you didn't expect real people to be watching it at this moment. So I mean, is there any, you know, ways that it's thought about, or maybe in specifically as a public affairs person?
No, not as a public affairs person. I mean, there's always rooms for multiple interpretations. That's valid for images, and it's also valid for language. But I think that, personally, I think there is always a kind of a limit for interpretation. That interpretation is not endlessly open. And if I can borrow an old theory of a famous Muslim mystic, Ibn Arabi, who basically says that, yeah, God wanted all the different possible interpretations of Quran to be accepted. So whatever interpretation you bring, it is accepted, and it was already intended, as long as it doesn't contradict the language. So you cannot say that water means hell, in a certain extent, because it is water and it's not fire. So as long as you are respecting the basic meanings of the word, you can make all the interpretation and all the different layers of interpretation. There is a first basic one that has to remain. And in this case, yes, it may be an anarchist that was who would have painted these ones, but then an anarchist would not have brought Jesus Christ in the middle.
Well, you get Christian anarchists, Tolstoy, for example. But that's anyway. But yeah, you're right. Obviously, it isn't painted by any anarchists, and I was sort of like abusing my sort of actual lack of studying them to make a wider point about context of.
Which is also
You have Monaco's an anarcho-capitalist state, is it not? And you know you get loads of right-wing capitalist anarchists. But anyway, that's beside the point. Yeah.
Arians, I think they're called. Yeah.
I just have to interject because as you're talking, Hyperallergic just published something about this image on Facebook, which is, of course, telling the truth all the time these days. And Sean Hannity is not giving the painting to Donald Trump.
It's not?
That's the new update.
Oh my
It was just
God.
recently tweeted. So there goes your conspiracy theory.
So it took back his gift.
He's not giving it.
Why not?
The tweet doesn't say.
Well.
But what Trump will be putting into his Oval Office at the bequest of Nigel Farage of UKIP is a bust of Winston Churchill, which was removed under the Obama administration, much to the chagrin of British nationalists. And brings me slightly to this idea of gifting, which has actually come out through three of your presentations as a kind of movement of an object from one power to another, as a way of trying to build a bridge, or as a way of trying to build a kind of narrative or show wealth or might. I don't know whether anyone had anything more to add to that.
Is it working? Yes. What I really liked about your talk is also that you touched on this aspect of magic. because in our rational thinking about politics, we have thus far had the illusion that you can keep this out of the window and we can get somewhere else with rational politics. But my colleagues that know more about Indonesia than I did also really pointed out to me, well, one thing to say is that these kings were so powerless. Yes, politically, but spiritually not. They were still powerful in a spiritual way. And this was completely, you can sort of see this shift happening, especially in photography, because of course photographs are never singular, they're always multiples. So that's kind of what, I'm a contemporary arts person, but what started fascinating me about these older photographs is to realize that so people would have their, not these montages, but these royal portraits, yes, people would have their portrait taken by a famous studio photographer. And then some of these portraits would travel as gifts that you would bestow onto certain people with your intentions. And then copies of those very same images would travel in souvenir albums of colonial offices. That is how they ended up in the archive, as Javanese prints, or as exotic types. The exact same picture of the exact same person that now I have begun to learn how to read whether it was produced as an exotic image or whether it was redistributed as an exotic image. And that sort of, balancing on the one hand of that one thing is then literally having multiple lives as multiple things in different contexts, but that at the same time, literally that one part of the audience is not programmed to see the magic, that actually is intentionally at work in the costume as well as in the replication of the costume through photography on behalf of the gift giver. So I really like that you brought that up.
Yeah, magic is my kind of, that's why I mentioned my kind of biography at the beginning, is I studied comparative religions as well, and of course that interest, especially I'm now living in France, where the question of religion is as a lot of places, quite a hot topic. And so I think the spirituality and magic, and that sometimes gets translated in some cases into religion. I think we talk about Timbuktu, the questions of what is official Islam and what is an Islam which is also kind of syncretistic with other spiritual things, is also quite interesting. And what I'm kind of going back to these images that I just discovered with your talk is, of course, for me also a magical way of infiltrating, as I said, reproducing that image around and working within a space of restraint to slowly undo that system or that machine, and to leave actually these traces, these contacts, this trace that is left now for us to reinterpret and see the power that was in that moment, although it was maybe disguised and not seen by the person who gifted it, or so we received it as a gift. And the idea of course, in the talk or the video, the white elephants given by Thais to Thai kings to their courtesans, as a way of, here's a great gift, but it'll also destroy you, I think is often one of the strategies used by those who don't hold center stage, but can use those margins to still act.
Is it on? Hi. But maybe we should open it up a bit more. I don't know if anyone has any burning questions or amendments or. No? Please.
Thanks. I was curious, and I'm not sure if I can phrase this question so sophisticated or proper way, but I was curious how also, well, it was maybe inspired by what you said about the responsibility of the artist to create the context for their work. But I also was wondering a bit about how the artist, also especially like considering two of the artists here, the techniques used in your work, like merging kind of sort of evidentiary fact with conspiracy theory, or working also with like fictional portrayals, like you said the character is you devoid of any redeeming qualities. Actually, how when those tactics, instead of sort of this idea of like the master's tools and the master's house, it's actually like the tools of the disenfranchised being adopted by the enfranchised. So you could say, for example, Donald Trump perhaps also plays the character of himself without any redeeming qualities from one perspective, or again, like this ability to work in a very creative way with evidence, truth, suspicion. And so, yeah, in a way, is there also kind of a need for artistic agency to model a kind of behavior for non-artistic creators or practitioners?
Yes. And I'll tell you why. No, probably won't. Increasingly, I mean, there's a level of impossibility once it kind of leaves your studio necessarily to always have absolute control, because it will be floating outside of your hands. But I think there are conditions that artists could set about, boycotting certain collectors or institutions, or whether you show as being at a show that's sponsored by the Israeli state or whatever. Artists have always been politically engaged in how their work is disseminated, or how much your artwork costs. Is it only affordable for the elites, or do you make it in larger editions, which is, do you give it for free online? Do you put a Creative Commons on it, or do you copyright it? Do you surround your artwork with letting your own perhaps political views be well known and documented? Do you imbue your art making with a mythos like Joseph Beuys does about his own biography that you then read back into it? There are lots of techniques that you can use to imbue an artwork with an expanded sort of meta-narrative, or but whether that's a tool that should be used for other cultural artifacts, I don't know. Each case is a very different argument to be fought for and thought through. But so there's no one model to follow. But I think it's important to sort of try to reclaim what our images do, and or inventions do, for that matter. Or what do you think?
I've had experiences where I've decided not to participate in certain invitations for reasons that were just uncomfortable for me. But I also know that I sometimes accept invitations, and I don't control, even if I'm present, exactly how things are interpreted. And that's always the question of things, interpretation and context, even getting beyond you. But I think what I try to do with the things I leave behind in my works is to, even if the content itself can be skewed, and that's the whole thing, that can be skewed in one way or the other, is just to try to show the mechanisms that works, instead of just using those horrible terms like common sense or things which are taken for granted, is to just show that this is a construction. And that's why I have these moments when I undermine my own narrative by very dry little bits of humor that come in that shouldn't follow the tone that's there, to then again show, okay, remember, I'm still constructing this. Of course, we're aware of that when we're watching it, but I just kind of hyper underline that to I guess refer back to thinking about all the facts that I'm presenting, to think, are they actually also constructed, or are they factual? So I think just by leaving those things that can then, of course, be brought somewhere else and put in another context, then unfortunately, I can't be with all of my works, or all of my silly things that I might say that get broadcast elsewhere, and they do leave. But when I am able to say yes or no to certain things, I sometimes do say no.
I do think it's an interesting, this is kind of the tease, I guess, between, traditionally we have form and content, right? But now, probably always throughout history, because we is specifically the word, things get shared and things get circulated, right? So one can have a discussion of what, literally you see, or what a building is, or specifically how we were talking about gravity and scope, and how do you trace that, and so on and so forth. But then another question emerges is, what do these things do? And of course you can collapse that back into reading it formally, but what does it do when it changes hands? And what does it do when someone has another interpretation? I mean, I'm not a Quran scholar, but you know, water could be quenching or it could be flooding. So to ask another question, if I say it's quenching, why am I saying that? What is my position and why would I be advancing that? So I think somewhat of what we were trying to tease in the show is to look again at what these things do and what counter narratives they make and what through their context other narratives are produced, and then bring them back and collapse them back. This was this idea of tracing. So sending something out to see what sticks to it, and then look and see what stuck to it and said, why did it stick, basically. And that's, you know, this is one of the beautiful things about, you know, of course we have trolling and we have all these negative things about broadcasting, but if you flip it in another way, it becomes this amazing mirror or inversion kind of technique in which it actually reads the social, right? And that's kind of, I think, to some degree what we were discussing. Not, yes, we can talk about form and content, and we were doing that, but also how does this either form a social, or how does a social, I'm using ridiculous terms, how does society, you know, inform and reinscribe the work? And that's, you know, partially why I think we invited everyone to look at that in different ways: ideological, artistic, historical, juridical, etc. And you know, just wanted to bring that out there. But how do we feel? Sun's going down.
Sounds like you just summed up as well. So it falls to me to thank all of our speakers today for coming and sharing their research and their work and their time with us. And thank you to you for coming and joining us. And round of applause.